in this news story. West Virginia stories they don't like to talk about. The industrial history of West Virginia is filled with stories of labor disputes and catastrophic failures that cost thousands of lives. State records from the early 20th century often gloss over the gritty details of how coal and silica mining actually operated. Locals in the small town of Gauley Bridge still whisper about a tunnel project that turned a mountain into a mass grave. The official death toll for the Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster remains a subject of intense debate among historians and archivists today. The following accounts reveal the dark underbelly of industry and crime that some officials in the region would prefer to forget. The story begins in 1930 during the height of the Great Depression, when work was incredibly hard to find. A large chemical company arrived in Fayette County with a plan to divert the New River through a 3-mile tunnel. They needed hundreds of men to drill through the hard rock of the mountain to create a hydroelectric power source. Recruiters traveled to the southern states and promised high wages to desperate men who needed to feed their starving families. These workers arrived in droves and set up temporary camps in the narrow valley without knowing the danger that awaited them. The geology of the mountain contained a high concentration of pure silica, which is deadly when inhaled in enclosed spaces. The engineers reportedly knew that the rock was dangerous, but the company refused to provide wet drilling equipment for the miners. The dry drilling method kicked up thick clouds of white dust that coated the lungs of every man in the tunnel. Workers described the air as being so thick with dust that they could barely see the person standing beside them. The foremen allegedly forced the men to return to the face of the tunnel immediately after blasting to save time. This practice exposed the laborers to the highest concentration of silica dust while their supervisors wore masks or stayed outside. Dispatch logs from the site indicate that men began to drop dead within weeks of starting the job. The company doctors officially listed the cause of death for these men as tunnelitis or simple cases of pneumonia. State records show that hundreds of men died during the short construction period, but the company denied any responsibility for the fatalities. The bodies of the African American workers were reportedly buried in mass graves on a nearby farm to hide the numbers. Undertakers were paid a small fee to dispose of the remains quickly without notifying the families of the deceased men. Some locals claimed that they saw trucks carrying bodies under the cover of darkness to unmarked fields near the river. The true number of victims is estimated to be over 700 men who died from acute silicosis. Investigators never confirmed the exact location of all the burial sites, despite decades of searching by local historical societies. The Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster is often cited as the worst industrial tragedy in the history of the United States. The company eventually paid a small settlement to some families, but the vast majority of the victims received absolutely nothing. The tunnel is still in operation today and pumps water from the New River to a local alloy plant. The water rushes through the dark passage where hundreds of men breathed their last breath in the choking white dust. It remains a somber monument to corporate greed and the expendable nature of human life in the early 20th century. Another story that haunts the archives of West Virginia involves a serial murderer who preyed on the lonely and vulnerable. Harry Powers was a charming man who lived in a quiet cottage in the small community of Quiet Dell. He presented himself as a wealthy civil engineer who was looking for a wife to share his comfortable life. Neighbors described him as a polite man who kept to himself and spent a lot of time in his garage. He reportedly placed advertisements in Lonely Hearts columns in magazines across the Midwest to lure wealthy widows to his home. The postmaster noticed that Powers received a staggering amount of mail from women who lived in distant states. The investigation began when a woman named Asta Eicher and her 3 children disappeared after leaving their home in Illinois. She had told friends that she was going to marry a man named Cornelius Pearson, who she met through letters. Police tracked the letters back to the cottage in Quiet Dell, where Harry Powers was living with his own wife. Investigators arrived at the scene and found a large collection of women's clothing and jewelry in the basement. They also discovered a soundproof room in the garage that was equipped with a gas line and a viewing window. The design of the room suggested that Powers watched his victims die slowly from the fumes of the gas. The search of the property intensified after police found a bloody hammer and charred bones in a drainage ditch nearby. Excavators dug up the soft earth around the garage and uncovered the bodies of Asta Eicher and her 3 children. They also found the body of another widow named Dorothy Lemke, who had vanished from her home in Massachusetts. The discoveries shocked the nation and turned the quiet hamlet into a spectacle for reporters and angry mobs of locals. State records indicate that Powers had been planning to kill many more women before the police finally intervened. He had reportedly constructed a new jail cell in his basement that he intended to use for future victims. Harry Powers was arrested and taken to the county jail, where a mob of thousands tried to lynch him. The sheriff had to use tear gas and fire hoses to disperse the crowd and protect the prisoner for trial. Powers confessed to the murders and claimed that he had killed many others before he moved to West Virginia. He spoke about his crimes with a cold detachment that terrified the seasoned detectives who interviewed him in his cell. The jury found him guilty after a short trial and sentenced him to death by hanging at the state penitentiary. The Bluebeard of Quiet Dell was executed in 1932, but his crimes left a permanent stain on the region. The final story concerns a terrifying event that destroyed an entire community in Logan County in 1972. The Buffalo Creek flood was a man-made disaster that was caused by the failure of a coal waste dam. The Pittston Coal Company had built 3 large impoundments on the side of a mountain to hold black wastewater. Residents of the Hollow had complained for years that the dams were unstable and leaked water constantly into their backyards. Company officials reportedly assured the town that the structures were safe and dismissed the concerns as hysterical nonsense from uneducated locals. The winter of that year was wet, and heavy rains filled the dams to their breaking point. The catastrophe struck on a Saturday morning when the upper dam collapsed and sent millions of gallons of water downstream. The black wave was estimated to be 30 feet high as it tore through the narrow valley at high speed. Survivors recalled hearing a roar that sounded like thunder before the wall of water and debris hit their homes. The flood destroyed 500 houses and picked up cars and trucks as if they were simple children's toys. Dispatch logs show that the water moved so fast that many people had no time to flee to higher ground. The slurry coated everything in a thick layer of black mud that made rescue operations incredibly difficult. 125 people lost their lives in the flood, and thousands were left homeless in a matter of minutes. State records list the cause of the failure as an act of God, according to the initial company statement. This claim enraged the survivors who knew that the dam had been built without any proper engineering or safety oversight. Investigators later confirmed that the dam was built on top of loose coal refuse that dissolved when it got wet. The legal battle that followed resulted in a settlement that many felt was too low for the loss of life. The psychological trauma of the event lingered in the valley long after the physical debris had been cleared away. The governor of West Virginia at the time was criticized for his close ties to the coal industry during the investigation. Archive notes suggest that the state had ignored multiple warnings from federal inspectors about the safety of the dam. The disaster forced a change in how mining waste was stored, but it came too late for the people of Buffalo Creek. Some locals claimed that they still see the ghosts of the victims walking along the creek bed at night. The valley is much quieter now, but the scars on the landscape serve as a reminder of the tragedy. It remains a stark example of what happens when profit is placed above the safety of a rural community. These 3 stories represent a dark chapter in the history of the mountains that many people prefer to ignore. The Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster showed how easily human life could be discarded in the pursuit of industrial progress. The crimes of Harry Powers revealed that monsters could hide in plain sight within the most peaceful of rural communities. The Buffalo Creek flood demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of corporate negligence and the failure of the state to protect its citizens. These events are not just campfire stories, but real tragedies that shaped the lives of thousands of West Virginians. The archives in Charleston hold many more files that contain the uncomfortable truths of the past century. In this news story, true stories that are more terrifying than fiction. On November 14, 2012, the dispatch logs for San Bernardino County recorded a chilling 911 call from a satellite phone that originated from a desolate sector of the Mojave Desert. The caller was identified by voice analysis as Marcus Hale, and he was breathing heavily while whispering about a tall figure standing on the ridgeline that refused to move. The transmission was heavily distorted by static and cut out abruptly after just 15 seconds of frantic and unintelligible screaming. Search teams deployed to the coordinates found only a single boot and a surveyor tripod left standing upright in the sand. Authorities eventually classified the case as a misadventure due to exposure, but archived notes suggest a far more complicated series of events involving conflicting data. Marcus Hale was a 34-year-old freelance geologist who specialized in mapping difficult terrain for private mining companies looking for rare earth metals. He brought his colleague Sarah Jenkins, who was a 29-year-old field technician responsible for collecting soil samples and managing the base camp logistics. They parked their rented Jeep near a dry wash in the Shadow Mountains, intended for a 4-day excursion into the federally protected wilderness. Their goal was to verify property lines near a canyon that showed unusual magnetic signatures on modern digital maps. State records indicate they checked in with a Bureau of Land Management ranger station at 8 in the morning on Friday. The couple hiked 6 miles into the arid landscape before setting up their base camp near a cluster of large boulders that offered shade from the midday sun. Marcus spent the afternoon calibrating his seismic equipment, while Sarah took photographs of the rock layers along the canyon walls for their preliminary report. A recovered memory card later showed images of the campsite that appeared normal until the sun began to set behind the mountains. The final 3 photos on the card display a blurred figure standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. Investigators never confirmed if this was a person or simply a trick of the light and shadows caused by the terrain. Dispatch logs show that the first sign of trouble occurred just after midnight on their second night in the desert. A commercial truck driver on a highway 20 miles away reported seeing a flare discharged from a location deep within the restricted zone. The driver contacted the California Highway Patrol, but no rescue mission was launched due to the lack of visual confirmation from a second source. Archived notes from the sheriff department mention that illegal smuggling routes were common in that specific region of the county. It remains unclear if Marcus and Sarah were the ones who fired the flare that the truck driver saw that night. On the morning of November 16th, a passing park ranger discovered the rental Jeep still parked at the trailhead with a layer of dust on the windshield. The vehicle was locked and contained their wallets, along with a map that had strange markings in red ink near the sector they were exploring. One of the rangers reportedly told police that the map led to an area known for abandoned mine shafts from the late 19th century. The local sheriff deputy noted in his file that the truck showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. This discovery prompted an official search and rescue operation that would become the largest in county history. Search teams combed the desert for 5 days using cadaver dogs and heat-seeking drones without any success in locating the missing geologists. The weather turned severe on the 3rd day, with high winds that hampered efforts and erased potential tracks on the sandy ground. A volunteer searcher eventually found the surveyor tripod standing alone in a clearing 5 miles from their base camp. The device was pointed directly at a dense patch of scrub brush that led into a deep ravine known as Devil's Throat. County files from 2012 state that the equipment was in perfect working order when it was recovered by the team. The single boot belonging to Sarah was found 2 days later near the bottom of that steep ravine, resting on a flat rock. It was neatly placed on top of the stone rather than being discarded or lost during a fall or struggle. Forensic analysis revealed no blood or DNA evidence on the boot other than that of Sarah herself, which baffled the crime scene technicians. Some locals claimed that the placement of the boot resembled markers used by indigenous tribes to warn travelers of danger. Investigators never confirmed this theory and treated the item as a simple piece of lost personal property found at the scene. A review of the satellite phone data provided a conflicting timeline regarding the final moments of the couple in the desert. The call log shows multiple attempts to dial out, starting at 3 in the morning on Sunday, which was hours before the flare was sighted. These calls failed to connect due to the lack of signal in the deep valleys of the rugged terrain. The final successful connection was the 15-second call that reached dispatch hours after the initial attempts failed to go through. The audio from that call was analyzed by state technicians who could not identify the rhythmic background noise. The search was officially suspended on November 22nd, after covering over 40 square miles of difficult and dangerous wilderness terrain. The family of the missing couple hired a private investigator to continue the search for another 2 months using private funds. This investigator reportedly found a makeshift shelter constructed from dead creosote bushes roughly 10 miles north of the tripod. Inside the shelter were food wrappers that matched the brand Marcus and Sarah had packed for their trip. No other physical trace of the couple has ever been found in the desert since that day. 2 years later, a recreational hiker found a waterproof journal buried under a pile of rocks near the makeshift shelter. The handwriting in the book matched that of Marcus and described a sense of being watched from the high ridges during the day. The final entry was dated November 17th, which contradicts the timeline established by the official police investigation report. Marcus wrote that they were moving north to escape a low humming sound that was causing them physical pain and confusion. Medical experts consulted on the case suggested this could be a symptom of dehydration or acute stress reaction. The area where they disappeared remains a popular spot for off-road enthusiasts, despite the unresolved nature of the case. Bureau of Land Management officials have since placed warning signs advising visitors to stay on the marked trails at all times. A documentary crew visited the site in 2019 and recorded a similar low-frequency humming sound on their audio equipment. The host claimed the noise made him feel nauseous and disoriented until he retreated back to his support vehicle. Records conflict regarding the source of this noise, with some blaming wind patterns and others citing geology. The official cause of death for Marcus and Sarah remains undetermined, as their bodies were never recovered from the desert. The file from 2012 sits in the cold case archives of the San Bernardino Sheriff Department, waiting for new leads. Every year on the anniversary of their disappearance, the family posts a reward for new information on the case. Dispatch logs from that night remain the only hard evidence of the terror they experienced in the end. The mystery of what happened in those canyons continues to haunt those who study the available data. Another incident that shares striking similarities occurred in the dense forests of Oregon in October of 2011. A solo hiker named David Paulides vanished from a trail that was considered well-traveled and safe for beginners. He was equipped with a GPS tracker that pinged his location every 10 minutes to a server monitored by his family. The tracking data showed him moving at a normal pace until 2 in the afternoon, when his speed increased dramatically. The final ping placed him 3 miles away from the trail in an area of nearly impassable brambles. Searchers who reached the coordinates found his backpack neatly leaned against a tree. David was a 45-year-old experienced outdoorsman who had hiked the Pacific Crest Trail twice in his youth. He carried a satellite messenger device that allowed him to send text messages in case of an emergency. The logs from the device show that he sent a message at 3 o'clock stating that he was being followed by something silent. This message was followed by another one 10 minutes later that simply read the colors red and silver. Authorities initially believed he was suffering from a medical episode or a hallucination induced by drugs. Toxicology reports were obviously impossible to run, as his body was never found. The search for David involved the National Guard and over 200 volunteers who walked shoulder to shoulder through the woods. They found his camera near a stream bed 5 miles from where his backpack was located. The photos on the digital camera showed the trail and various scenic views of the mountain range. The last photo taken was a blurry image of the tree canopy that appeared to be taken from the ground looking up. Forensic analysts noted that the timestamp on the photo was 3 hours after his final GPS ping. This discrepancy suggests that David was alive and moving for much longer than the tracking data indicated. Witnesses at the trailhead reported seeing a man matching the description of David talking to a stranger in a gray van. The stranger was reportedly wearing a wool coat, which was unusual for the warm weather that day. Police sketches of the stranger were circulated, but no one ever came forward to identify the man. The van was never seen on any of the security cameras in the nearby towns or gas stations. Investigators never confirmed if this interaction was related to the disappearance or just a random encounter. In 2014, a group of hunters found a collection of items in a cave nearly 12 miles from the search zone. The items included a flashlight and a water bottle that were identified as belonging to David. The flashlight was disassembled with the batteries placed in a neat row next to the casing. The water bottle was full of water despite the fact that David had been missing for 3 years. Archived notes from the medical examiner state that the water was fresh and did not contain the algae expected after 3 years. This detail has led to numerous theories, but no concrete answers. The case of David Paulides remains open and active with the local county sheriff department. His family believes that he was abducted, but they lack the evidence to prove a crime was committed. The area where he vanished has a history of unexplained disappearances dating back to the 1950s. Some locals claim that the woods are home to feral humans who live off the grid and avoid contact. Investigators never confirmed the existence of such people despite numerous reports over the decades. The final story involves a family of 4 who disappeared from their farmhouse in rural Kansas in 2009. The Jameson family was last seen by a neighbor on a Sunday evening working in their garden. When the mail carrier arrived on Monday morning, the house was silent and the front door was standing wide open. Inside the house, the police found dinner plates on the table with food that had been untouched. The family dog was found locked in the shed behind the house, which was highly unusual behavior for the family. Dispatch logs show that no calls for help were made from the landline or cell phones. State records indicate that the father had recently withdrawn a large sum of money from his bank account. This led investigators to initially suspect that the family had fled voluntarily to escape debt. However, the discovery of their wallets and passports in a drawer in the master bedroom ruled out that theory. The family van was found parked 3 miles down a dirt road, hidden behind a row of trees. The keys were in the ignition, and the gas tank was full. A search of the vehicle revealed a GPS unit that had been programmed with a destination in the middle of a nearby lake. Divers searched the lake for weeks, but found no trace of the family or any other vehicle. The water was murky and filled with debris, which made the operation dangerous and slow. Sonar equipment picked up several large shapes on the bottom, but they turned out to be submerged logs. The sheriff eventually called off the underwater search, citing a lack of credible leads. Archived notes from the investigation mentioned that the father had reportedly been acting paranoid in the weeks leading up to the event. He had told a coworker that he was seeing lights in the fields at night. 4 years later, a farmer clearing land found skeletal remains in a shallow grave 20 miles from the Jameson home. Dental records confirmed that the remains belonged to the 2 children of the family. The parents have never been found and are presumed dead by the authorities. The file from 2009 contains a witness statement from a local teenager who saw a black helicopter in the area. This statement was dismissed at the time as a fabrication, but has since gained attention online. Investigators never confirmed the presence of any aircraft in the sector that night. The mystery of the Jameson family is often cited as one of the most baffling cases in Kansas history. The house stood empty for years until it was eventually demolished by the county due to safety concerns. Locals reported seeing lights in the windows of the abandoned house long after the power was cut. These reports were dismissed as reflections or pranks by teenagers daring each other to visit. The dispatch logs and the archived notes are the only testament to a tragedy that has no explanation. The truth of what happened remains buried somewhere in the vast plains. In this new story, true stories from inside. A deadly winter snowstorm. The winter storm that struck the Cascade Mountains in 2022 remains a subject of intense analysis. State records from the Department of Transportation confirm that the highway system closed completely for 48 hours. The following narrative details the timeline of the incident based on recovered cell phone data and police reports. The temperature reportedly dropped 30 degrees in 1 hour, while the wind gusts exceeded 70 miles per hour. Sarah Jenkins was a 28-year-old graphic designer who was traveling home to Seattle for the holidays. She was driving a reliable all-wheel drive vehicle that was equipped with standard winter tires and emergency supplies. Her passenger was David Miller, who was a 30-year-old accountant and a longtime friend from their university days. They planned to drive over Stevens Pass in the afternoon to avoid the heavy traffic predicted for the evening. The highway cameras showed clear pavement when they departed Leavenworth at 2 p.m., according to the time-stamped footage. The weather conditions shifted violently when they reached the summit near the tunnel entrance at 3 p.m. A sudden atmospheric river collided with Arctic air and created a localized blizzard that blinded drivers instantly. Sarah reportedly attempted to pull over to the shoulder, but the lane markers were completely obscured by snow. The vehicle dashcam footage recovered later shows the car sliding sideways before tumbling down a steep embankment. The car came to rest upside down in a dense thicket of trees, roughly 50 feet below the road. The airbags deployed successfully, but the electrical system of the vehicle failed immediately upon the final impact. They managed to crawl out of the shattered passenger window and assess their situation in the deep snow. David suffered a minor head wound during the crash, while Sarah escaped with only bruising and shock. They realized that climbing back up the steep and icy slope to the highway was physically impossible. A downloaded map on the phone belonging to Sarah indicated a Forest Service cabin was located nearby. They decided to hike toward the structure rather than risk freezing to death inside the crushed metal vehicle. The wind noise was so loud that they had to scream to communicate with each other. The hike to the cabin took them over 2 hours, despite the distance being less than 1 mile. The snow was waist deep in certain areas and required them to exert tremendous energy to move forward. David reportedly began to exhibit signs of confusion and lethargy, which are classic symptoms of early hypothermia. They reached the structure just as the daylight faded completely and the temperature dipped into the single digits. The cabin was a small wooden structure that appeared abandoned, but the front door was unlocked and functional. They stumbled inside and barricaded the door against the wind that was shaking the entire wooden frame. The interior of the cabin was freezing, but it offered protection from the biting wind and wet snow. They used the flashlight from the phone to inspect the single room and found a rusted wood stove. There was no firewood inside the cabin, and the furniture consisted of a single metal cot frame. Sarah recorded a video diary entry at 7 p.m. to document their location in case they died. The audio captures the sound of the wind howling outside, and something else that sounds like heavy footsteps. Investigators later suggested the sound was likely a loose shutter banging against the exterior wall of the cabin. They huddled together in the corner of the room, wrapped in the emergency blankets they salvaged from the car. David reportedly fell asleep quickly despite the cold, while Sarah remained awake to monitor the sounds outside. She claimed in a later interview that she heard someone walking circles around the cabin for hours. The footsteps were heavy and rhythmic, and they crunched loudly on the frozen snow crust near the walls. She tried to wake David to listen, but he was unresponsive and breathing shallowly in the dark. She turned off her phone to conserve the battery and sat in the darkness, terrified and freezing. The noises stopped abruptly around midnight, and a heavy silence settled over the isolated mountain valley. Sarah reportedly moved to the single dusty window to see if she could spot any rescue lights. The moon broke through the clouds for a brief moment and illuminated the clearing in front of the cabin. She saw a tall figure standing motionless at the edge of the trees, roughly 30 yards away. The figure appeared to be wearing a dark coat and was staring directly at the cabin window. She blinked and rubbed the frost from the glass, but the figure remained perfectly still in the snow. She retreated to the corner and shook David violently until he woke up and asked what was wrong. She whispered that someone was watching them from the woods and that they needed to be quiet. David reportedly dismissed her claim as a hallucination caused by the extreme stress and the lack of sleep. He insisted that no one else would be out in a storm that had closed the highway. They argued in hushed tones for several minutes before a loud thud against the door silenced them. The impact shook dust from the ceiling rafters and sounded like a heavy body hitting the wood. They remained frozen in silence for the rest of the night as the temperature inside the cabin dropped further. The county file from 2022 notes that the low temperature that night reached 10 below zero. They could hear scratching sounds on the exterior walls that moved from the door to the window. Sarah later described the sound as someone testing the integrity of the wood with a sharp tool. They did not have a weapon, and they were too weak from the cold to fight back. The scratching continued until the first light of dawn began to turn the sky a gray color. The search and rescue helicopter spotted the wreckage of their vehicle at 8 a.m. the following morning. The flight crew followed the tracks leading away from the crash site and located the cabin nearby. The rescue swimmer descended to the clearing and found Sarah and David waving frantically from the cabin door. They were hoisted to the helicopter and transported to a hospital in Seattle for immediate medical treatment. The doctors treated them for severe frostbite and dehydration, but they were expected to make a full recovery. The police took their statements regarding the crash and their subsequent hike to the shelter in the woods. A park ranger returned to the site 2 days later to retrieve the personal items left behind. The report filed by the ranger notes that the cabin was actually a derelict structure scheduled for demolition. The roof had partially collapsed years prior, and the windows were missing their glass panes entirely. The ranger noted that the structure should have been filled with snow and offered no protection from the wind. He could not explain how the interior remained dry or how the temperature inside stayed survivable. The footprints found around the cabin were also noted in the official file from 2022. The tracks circling the cabin did not match the boots worn by either Sarah or David that night. They were described as barefoot prints that were roughly twice the size of a human foot. The stride length between the prints suggested a creature that stood over 7 feet tall and moved easily. The tracks circled the structure continuously and stopped directly in front of the window where Sarah stood. The prints then led away from the cabin and vanished into the dense forest heading north. No other human tracks were found in the area, and no other hikers were reported missing. Sarah refuses to discuss the figure she saw and has not returned to the mountains since the incident. David claims he has no memory of the noises or the argument they had during the night. The official explanation is that the couple suffered from shared delusions brought on by the extreme cold. However, the photos taken by the ranger show the dry floor inside the ruined cabin clearly. The case file remains a strange anomaly in the records of the Department of Natural Resources. It serves as a chilling example of the unexplained events that occur when winter storms isolate the wild. In this news story, this sounds impossible, but it really happened. The North Maine Woods is an immense tract of commercial forest land that covers over 3 million acres of wilderness. This region is geographically isolated and contains few paved roads, which makes it one of the most remote areas in America. Dispatch logs from 2012 indicate that the county manages dozens of distinct missing person reports every single calendar year. Most of these cases are resolved within 48 hours, but some files remain open due to a complete lack of evidence. The baffling disappearance at Eagle Lake remains one of the most disturbing and controversial cases in the history of the state. Local authorities have never released the full details of the crime scene to the public for reasons involving operational security. Elias Thorne was a 34-year-old architect who lived in the busy and congested city of Boston, Massachusetts. He had recently inherited a dilapidated cabin near the Canadian border that had belonged to his grandfather for 40 years. His younger brother, Julian, was a 30-year-old paramedic who desperately wanted a break from his stressful medical career. They planned to spend 2 weeks repairing the roof and clearing the overgrown brush around the perimeter of the property. State records show that they crossed the North Maine Woods checkpoint gate on Monday, September 3rd of 2012. The guard at the gate later testified that both men seemed in good spirits and were eager to start working. The brothers drove their heavy pickup truck along the winding gravel roads that led deep into the uninhabited forest sector. They stopped at a small general store in the town of Ashland to purchase final supplies and fuel for the generator. A clerk at the store remembered them clearly because they bought a large amount of non-perishable food and several tarps. She reportedly told investigators that Elias seemed concerned about the weather forecast, which predicted heavy storms later in the week. Julian told the clerk they had high-quality rain gear and were not afraid of a little water during the trip. They left the store around noon and drove north toward the unpaved logging roads that accessed the remote lake. They arrived at the remote site late in the afternoon as the sun began to dip below the tall pine trees. Elias noticed immediately that the front door was unlocked, which seemed odd since the cabin had been vacant for years. They swept out the accumulated dust and set up their sleeping bags in the main living area near the stone fireplace. Julian reportedly mentioned to his brother that the woods felt unnaturally quiet for that specific time of year in Maine. They ate a quick dinner of canned soup and went to sleep early to prepare for the hard labor ahead. A ranger patrol vehicle passed the access road that night and noted nothing unusual near the entrance of the property. Work began the next morning on the damaged roof, while Julian cleared the dense thicket near the shore of the lake. Elias found strange markings on the wooden shingles that looked like they were made by a heavy metal tool. He called down to Julian, who was standing on the dock and staring intently at something floating in the dark water. Julian claimed he saw a large, dark shape submerge just as he turned his head to look at the lake's surface. They dismissed the event as a trick of the light and continued their physical labor until the sun went down. The evening passed without incident, but the brothers decided to keep their heavy flashlights close by as they slept. The atmosphere changed drastically on the third night when a heavy storm system moved into the region from the north. They sat by the fire and listened to the wind howl through the cracks in the old wooden walls of the cabin. A loud crash outside the structure made them both jump to their feet and grab their defensive tools from the bag. Elias opened the door and shone his beam into the darkness where the company truck was parked on the gravel. He saw that the windshield was shattered and the hood was dented as if something heavy had landed on the metal. Police reports state that footprints were found in the mud around the vehicle but were washed away by the rain. They retreated inside the cabin and locked the heavy door with a deadbolt that they had installed just that morning. Julian tried to use the landline to call for help, but the line was dead and offered no dial tone. Archived notes state that a distress signal was picked up by a radio tower 20 miles away at exactly midnight. The operator heard a voice screaming for help, but the static made it impossible to identify the speaker or the words. The signal lasted for 10 seconds before it cut out completely and left the operator in a state of total silence. Dispatchers tried to trace the location of the radio transmission, but the storm interfered with the triangulation signal. The storm raged for another 6 hours and made travel on the logging roads impossible due to the thick mud. Investigators believe the brothers remained inside the cabin during this time based on the evidence found in the living room. Notes from the scene describe a half-finished game of cards sitting on the table near the cold fireplace. It appeared that they were trying to distract themselves while they waited for the sun to rise and the storm to pass. The timeline becomes unclear between the hours of 2 in the morning and dawn on Thursday, September 6th. No witnesses were within 20 miles of the location, and the radio remained silent for the rest of the night. A park ranger named Thomas Higgins was the first person to arrive at the scene 2 days later on Saturday morning. He noticed the damaged truck from the main road and pulled his vehicle into the driveway to investigate the situation. The cabin door was standing wide open and was swinging back and forth in the breeze that came off the lake. Higgins drew his weapon and approached the structure while calling out for anyone who might be inside the building. He received no answer and slowly entered the cabin to find a scene that he later described as confusing. The furniture was overturned and a large pool of blood was found near the back door leading to the woods. He immediately radioed for backup and secured the perimeter while waiting for the county sheriff deputies to arrive on site. The deputies arrived 2 hours later and began a systematic search of the cabin and the surrounding wooded area. Police reports confirmed that the blood type matched Elias, but there was no sign of the architect anywhere in the building. They searched the surrounding forest for weeks, but found no trace of either brother in the immediate area of the cabin. The tools they had brought for the renovation were also missing from the locked shed behind the main house. The investigation was hampered by the remote location and the lack of forensic evidence due to the heavy rain. A discovery was made 5 miles away near an old logging road that had not been used in over 2 decades. Search dogs located Julian's left boot near a steep ravine, but the rest of his clothing was never recovered. Detectives found footprints in the mud that did not match the tread of the boots worn by the missing men. The stride was too long for a human, and the depth suggested a weight of over 400 pounds. Experts analyzed the tracks but could not determine what type of footwear or creature could make such distinct impressions. This evidence was sealed in the county file from 2012 and was never fully explained to the family. The search team expanded their grid to cover a 10-mile radius around the cabin over the next 10 days. Volunteers from the local town joined the effort and walked line abreast through the dense underbrush and pine forests. They found a ripped piece of flannel shirt that matched the description of the shirt Elias was wearing that week. The fabric was found snagged on a branch about 7 feet off the ground, which was an unusual height. Some locals claimed that a bear could have left it there, but no bear tracks were found in that sector. The discovery of the shirt only added to the confusion regarding the direction of travel the men had taken. The case file from 2012 contains a witness statement from a logger who worked in the area that night. He claimed he saw 2 men running across the road on the night of the storm without any shoes. He slowed his truck to help them, but they ran into the trees and ignored his shouts for them to stop. The logger reported the sighting to the sheriff, but his account was dismissed initially due to the lack of evidence. Authorities never confirmed if the men he saw were Elias and Julian or just local poachers fleeing the storm. The description of their clothing matched what the brothers were wearing when they were last seen alive by the clerk. Detectives interviewed the logger again 2 weeks later to see if he could recall any other specific details from that night. He stated that the men looked terrified and were looking back over their shoulders as they ran into the darkness. He also mentioned that he saw a third figure standing at the edge of the tree line near the road. He described the third figure as being much taller than the 2 men and wearing a dark-colored cloak or coat. This detail was not included in the initial report because the logger thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The mention of a third figure aligned with the theory that the brothers were victims of a violent crime. Forensic experts analyzed the damage to the truck hood and concluded that the impact was caused by a single strike. The metal was bent inward with a force that would require a sledgehammer or a large rock dropped from a height. No such tool or rock was found near the truck, which deepened the mystery of how the damage occurred. The shattered windshield glass was found inside the cab, which indicated the force came from the outside and pushed inward. Investigators dusted the truck for fingerprints, but found only the prints of Elias and Julian and the previous owner. The lack of third-party DNA on the truck made it difficult to build a case against a suspect. Family members of the brothers hired a private investigator to look into the case 6 months after the official search ended. The investigator spent weeks in the town interviewing locals and reviewing the public records related to the property. He found that the grandfather had complained about trespassers on his land in the years before he passed away. The grandfather had filed several reports with the county about strange noises and items moving around in his yard at night. These reports were largely ignored at the time because the grandfather was known to be eccentric and paranoid. The private investigator believed these past incidents were directly connected to the disappearance of the 2 brothers. The private investigator also found a diary in the cabin that the police had cataloged but not fully analyzed. The diary belonged to the grandfather and contained entries about watchers in the woods who observed the house. The last entry in the diary was dated 3 years prior and simply said that he was leaving to stay safe. This new information suggested that the threat in the area had been present for a long time before the brothers arrived. The family turned this information over to the state police, who added it to the growing case file. However, the new lead did not result in any arrests or the recovery of the bodies. Rumors began to circulate in the local community that the brothers had stumbled upon an illegal drug operation in the forest. Some locals believed they were silenced by criminals who used the remote woods to hide their illicit activities. Dispatch logs show that police raided a site 10 miles away the following year, but found no connection to the Thorn case. The drug theory remained popular, but it failed to explain these strange footprints and the lack of vehicle tracks. The isolation of the North Maine woods allows for many theories to flourish without any concrete proof to disprove them. The truth was likely far more complicated than a simple criminal encounter. Another theory suggested that a large predator, such as a rogue bear or a cougar, attacked the men. This theory explained the blood and the shredded tent, but it did not explain the locked door or the radio call. Animal attacks in the region are rare and usually leave behind significant evidence, such as hair and distinct tracks. The tracks found near the ravine were bipedal and did not match the paw prints of any known animal in Maine. Wildlife experts consulted on the case were baffled by the casts of the footprints and could not offer an identification. The animal attack theory was eventually ruled unlikely by the lead detective on the case. The cabin has since fallen back into a state of total disrepair and is avoided by locals who know the history. The roof that the brothers tried to fix has collapsed, and the forest has begun to reclaim the wooden structure. Dispatch logs show that no one has called for help from that specific location in over 10 years since the event. The fate of the Thorne brothers remains a mystery that defies all logical explanation to this day in the county. Investigators admit privately that this case is the strangest one they have encountered in their entire professional careers. The file sits in a cold case box and awaits new evidence that may never actually arrive. In this news story, they were trapped in a winter snowstorm. The official search and rescue report from Grafton County details a harrowing timeline of events that occurred during the winter of 2014. State records indicate that the weather conditions in the White Mountains deteriorated far more rapidly than any forecast model had predicted that morning. The temperature at the summit reportedly dropped 40 degrees in the span of 3 hours, while wind gusts exceeded 80 miles per hour. This narrative reconstructs the incident using recovered digital files and witness statements included in the county file from 2014. Elias Thorne was a 29-year-old structural engineer from Boston who spent his weekends cataloging the rugged terrain of northern New Hampshire. He was accompanied by Marcus Vane, who was a 31-year-old freelance photographer attempting to build a portfolio of high-altitude winter landscapes. The two men arrived at the trailhead near Franconia Notch at approximately 4 a.m. to secure a parking spot before the sunrise. Dispatch logs show that they registered their hike at the ranger station and listed a return time of 4 p.m. They carried high-quality winter gear and enough rations for a single day, but they lacked supplies for an overnight emergency bivouac. Witnesses who were descending the trail later that morning reportedly saw Elias and Marcus stopping frequently to take photographs of the frost formations. A group of hikers mentioned in the police report that the two men seemed in high spirits and were moving at a consistent pace. The atmospheric conditions at noon were reportedly clear, with unlimited visibility across the valley floor and the surrounding peaks. However, the archived weather data reveals that a low-pressure system was moving in from the northwest much faster than anticipated. The blue sky reportedly turned a bruised purple color within minutes as the cloud ceiling dropped below the ridgeline. The storm struck the mountain range with almost zero warning and trapped anyone above the tree line in a blinding wash of white snow. Elias and Marcus were reportedly near the summit when the visibility dropped to less than 5 feet in every direction. A recovered digital voice recorder belonging to Marcus captured the initial moments of their confusion as the wind noise obliterated their conversation. The audio file from 2014 contains the sound of Elias shouting that they needed to find cover immediately before the temperature killed them. They reportedly abandoned their plan to descend the main trail because the markers were completely invisible in the driving snow. They managed to locate a shallow rock depression roughly 300 yards from the main trail, according to the GPS data recovered later. This natural formation offered minimal protection from the biting wind, but it was the only shelter available in the immediate vicinity. Elias recorded a video on his smartphone at 2:30 p.m. where he documented their situation for what he called insurance purposes. The footage reportedly shows Marcus huddled in the corner of the rock overhang while trying to warm his hands with chemical packs. Investigators noted that the skin on the face of Marcus already appeared waxy and pale, which indicated the onset of frostbite. The situation deteriorated rapidly as night fell over the mountain and the ambient temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. The dispatch logs indicate that no distress calls were received during the daylight hours, likely due to the interference from the storm. A hiker stranded in a cabin 3 miles away later reported hearing strange mechanical noises echoing off the canyon walls that night. This witness statement conflicts with the official explanation that the only sounds in the valley were the wind and falling timber. The county file from 2014 notes that the storm continued unabated for 14 consecutive hours without a break. Elias managed to make a brief connection with a 911 operator at exactly 8:14 p.m., according to the state telecommunications records. The call lasted only 20 seconds, and the audio is heavily distorted by static and the sound of the gale force winds. The transcript in the case file reveals that Elias whispered he could see something moving in the darkness just beyond their shelter. He reportedly told the operator that they were not alone on the ridge and that something was circling their position. The call cut off abruptly before the operator could obtain better coordinates or clarify what Elias meant by the words circling. The search and rescue teams mobilized at first light the following morning when the wind speeds finally dropped to a manageable level. 2 separate teams approached the ridge from the north and south to maximize the probability of locating the missing men. They discovered the rock formation shortly before noon, but the scene they found confused the veteran first responders present. The backpacks and heavy coats belonging to Elias and Marcus were neatly arranged against the back wall of the shallow cave. However, the men themselves were gone, and there were no footprints leading away from the cave entrance in the fresh snow. The lead investigator noted in his field journal that it looked as if the men had simply evaporated from the shelter. The snow that had fallen overnight was pristine and unbroken by any tracks for a radius of 500 yards. The search team expanded their perimeter and began probing the deep snowdrifts with poles in case the men were buried nearby. They found the professional camera belonging to Marcus buried under a foot of snow roughly 50 yards from the cave. The device was frozen solid, but forensic technicians managed to retrieve the data from the memory card inside. The photos on the card documented the decline of the 2 men as the night progressed and the cold took hold. Most of the images were blurry or completely black due to the lack of light and the shaking hands of the photographer. However, one photograph, timestamped at 2:03 a.m., shows a figure standing in the snow at the edge of the camera flash range. The figure appears to be wearing no winter clothing and stands perfectly still while facing away from the camera lens. Forensic analysts scrutinized the image for weeks, but could not determine if it was a real person or a digital artifact. Some locals claimed the figure matched descriptions from older folklore in the region, but authorities dismissed these claims as superstition. The search continued for 3 days with no results until a state police helicopter spotted a thermal anomaly in the dense forest. The location of the heat signature was 2 miles down the mountain and across a treacherous ravine that was deemed impassable. The ground team hiked to the coordinates and found Elias sitting at the base of a massive pine tree. He was alive, but he was suffering from severe hypothermia and he was in a catatonic state, unable to communicate. The medical report from the hospital indicates that he had no memory of how he traveled that distance without his boots or coat. Elias remained in the hospital for 2 weeks, while detectives tried to extract any information regarding the location of Marcus. He reportedly stared blankly at the wall whenever the investigators asked him about the figure in the photograph or the events of that night. The doctors stated that his trauma was consistent with extreme exposure, but they could not explain his lack of physical injuries from the terrain. The distance he traveled would have required him to cross jagged rocks and deep snowdrifts that should have left marks. The county file from 2014 lists his statement as inconclusive because he simply claimed the dark helped him. The body of Marcus Vane has never been recovered, despite annual searches of the surrounding valleys and the melting snowpacks in the spring. The official conclusion states that he likely succumbed to the elements and was buried in a location that searchers missed. However, the archived notes from the lead investigator mention a set of tracks found near the tree where they located Elias. The tracks did not match any known animal native to the region, and they stopped abruptly in the middle of a clearing. The prints were described as elongated and narrow, with no discernible tread pattern or toe marks visible in the snow. The family of Marcus Vane hired a private investigator later that year to review the files and visit the site of the disappearance. The private investigator reportedly found shreds of clothing matching the jacket Marcus wore roughly 1 mile east of the cave. The fabric was torn in a way that suggested it had been snagged on branches or rocks during a frantic flight. This discovery contradicts the theory that the men stayed in the cave until they became delirious from the cold. The presence of the clothing suggests that Marcus left the safety of the shelter and ran blindly into the storm. The case remains open but inactive as of the last update to the county file in 2020. Elias Thorne eventually recovered physically, but he reportedly refuses to speak about the incident or return to the state of New Hampshire. The photograph of the figure standing in the snow remains the only piece of physical evidence that suggests a third party was present. State park rangers continue to warn hikers about the unpredictable weather in the White Mountains and the dangers of the ridge. The disappearance of Marcus Vane serves as a grim reminder that some events in the wild remain permanently unexplained. In this new story, these stories sound fake until you realize they're 100% true. The Olympic National Forest in Washington state covers over 500,000 acres of dense and rugged wilderness terrain. This vast landscape is known for its towering trees and frequent rainfall that creates a dark and damp atmosphere. Visitors often report feeling a sense of isolation when they venture deep into the remote corners of this park. Dispatch logs from 2015 suggest that the region has one of the highest rates of unexplained disappearances. Several hikers have vanished without a trace, while others have returned with stories that authorities struggle to verify. The following account is based on police reports and witness statements filed in King County during that same year. Mark Anderson was a 28-year-old accountant who lived in a small apartment in downtown Seattle. He wanted to escape the stress of his corporate job by spending a weekend in the quiet mountains. His partner was a 26-year-old nurse named Sarah Jenkins, who had significant experience with outdoor survival. They planned to hike a remote trail that wound through the western edge of the expansive national forest. The couple packed enough food for 3 days and brought a durable tent for the cold autumn nights. State records indicate they registered their vehicle at the ranger station on Friday, October 16th of 2015. The hike began without incident as they trekked 5 miles into the dense forest away from the main road. Sarah noticed that the woods were unusually quiet, and she reportedly mentioned this observation to Mark several times. They set up their campsite near a small stream as the sun began to set behind the trees. Mark gathered firewood, while Sarah arranged their sleeping bags inside the small tent they had pitched on flat ground. The temperature dropped quickly, and they sat by the fire to eat a simple meal of dehydrated food. A park ranger later told investigators that the weather that night was clear, with very little wind recorded. They extinguished the fire around 10 at night and retreated into the tent to get some needed sleep. Mark woke up 2 hours later because he heard a heavy, rhythmic thudding sound coming from the nearby woods. He lay still and listened as the sound grew louder and seemed to circle the perimeter of their campsite. Sarah woke up moments later and reportedly squeezed his arm when she heard the heavy footsteps approaching their tent. The couple remained silent as they listened to the movement that sounded like a large bipedal figure walking. Police reports state that Mark reached for his hunting knife but did not unzip the door of the tent. The footsteps stopped abruptly right outside the thin fabric of the tent, and the couple held their breath in fear. A strange, guttural sound that resembled a low mechanical hum vibrated through the ground beneath their sleeping bodies. Sarah claimed later that she saw a large shadow block the moonlight that was filtering through the tent walls. They waited for 10 minutes in absolute silence until the heavy footsteps slowly retreated back into the deep woods. Mark waited another hour before he finally fell back asleep out of pure exhaustion and lingering nervous tension. They woke up at dawn to find the campsite undisturbed, but they felt an urge to leave immediately. They packed their gear quickly and began the hike back to the trailhead without eating breakfast or drinking water. Sarah stopped about 1 mile down the trail when she noticed something odd on the trunk of a tree. A series of deep scratches marred the bark about 8 feet off the ground, which was too high for bears. Mark took a photo of the markings, which was later submitted to the authorities as part of the file. They hurried back to their car and drove straight to the ranger station to report the strange nocturnal event. The ranger on duty took their statement, but admitted that he had heard similar stories from other frightened hikers. Investigators returned to the site 2 days later to document the scene and look for any physical evidence. Archive notes show they found impressions in the mud that measured 18 inches long and 6 inches wide. The stride length between the tracks was nearly 5 feet, which ruled out most humans or known local wildlife. Dispatch logs confirm that a search of the area yielded no signs of other campers or distinct animal dens. The scratches on the tree were analyzed, but experts could not identify the animal that created the deep marks. The case file from 2015 remains open because no logical explanation was ever found for the encounter. Another incident occurred in the same region just 3 months later, involving a solo hiker named David Miller. David was a 32-year-old photographer who specialized in capturing images of rare birds in their natural habitat. He parked his truck at a remote trailhead on a Tuesday morning in January of 2016. His plan was to hike 4 miles to a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. Family members contacted the police when David failed to return home by the following Thursday evening as planned. A search and rescue team was deployed on Friday morning to scan the area for any sign of him. The search team located his tent about 3 miles from the trailhead in a small clearing near a cliff. The tent was collapsed, and the fabric had been shredded by what looked like a very sharp object. Inside the tent, they found his sleeping bag and camera gear, which had been smashed into unsuspecting pieces. State records indicate that his wallet and keys were still in the pocket of his heavy winter jacket. There was no blood at the scene and no sign of a struggle outside the immediate tent area. The team followed a trail of disturbed vegetation that led toward the edge of the steep, rocky cliff. They found his digital camera lying in the brush about 50 feet away from the edge of the drop. Investigators recovered the memory card and analyzed the photos to see if they held clues to his disappearance. The last photo on the card was taken at night and showed a blurry figure standing in the trees. The figure appeared to be tall and pale, but the poor lighting made it impossible to identify facial features. Some locals claimed it was a trick of the light, while others believed it showed a person watching him. The official report lists the image as inconclusive evidence, and it did not help locate the missing man. The search continued for 2 weeks, but heavy snow hampered the efforts of the rescue teams on the ground. A helicopter crew scanned the base of the cliff but found no trace of David or his clothing. The sheriff eventually suspended the search and declared David Miller a missing person, presumed dead due to exposure. His truck remained at the trailhead for another month until his family finally came to retrieve it. The file from 2016 contains conflicting theories from detectives who could not agree on a single suspect. Some investigators believed he fell, while others suspected foul play involving a second party who was never found. A third event took place in a cabin located near the southern border of the forest in 2017. A retired couple named John and Mary moved there to enjoy the solitude of the mountains in their old age. They were both 60 years old and had spent their careers working in the education system in Oregon. The cabin was situated 5 miles from the nearest neighbor and had no cell phone service or internet connection. They relied on a landline to communicate with their children who lived several hours away in the city. The trouble began on a stormy night in November when the power lines were damaged by falling branches. John went outside to check the generator, while Mary stayed inside to light candles in the living room area. He reportedly heard a voice calling his name from the edge of the woods near the back of the property. He shone his flashlight toward the trees, but the beam was not strong enough to penetrate the thick darkness. He returned inside and told Mary that he thought someone was stranded in the storm and needed their help. They stood by the window and watched as a light appeared in the woods and moved toward the house. Dispatch logs show that Mary called the police on the landline at exactly 11:30 that night. She told the operator that a stranger was standing on their porch and refusing to answer their questions. The stranger was described as wearing tattered clothing that did not look suitable for the freezing winter weather. John grabbed his shotgun and warned the person through the locked door to leave their property immediately. The person did not respond, but instead began to pound on the solid wood door with incredible physical force. The operator heard the sound of glass breaking before the line went dead and the connection was lost. Deputies arrived at the cabin 40 minutes later to find the front door smashed off its hinges. The cabin was empty, and there was no sign of John or Mary anywhere inside the small structure. The furniture was overturned, and deep gouge marks were found on the walls of the main hallway. Deputies searched the muddy ground outside and found 2 sets of footprints leading away into the dense forest. One set of tracks belonged to boots, while the other set appeared to be bare human feet. The tracks continued for 2 miles before they vanished abruptly in the middle of a snowy clearing. A massive search operation was launched the next morning, involving dogs and volunteers from the local community. They found John 3 days later wandering near a highway about 10 miles away from his destroyed cabin. He was suffering from severe hypothermia and could not remember how he had gotten there or where Mary was. Medical records state that he had deep bruises on his arms that looked like finger marks from large hands. He was treated at a hospital and interviewed by detectives, but his memory of the night was fragmented. He claimed he remembered the cold wind and the sound of Mary screaming, but nothing else was clear. Mary was never found, and her case remains one of the most baffling mysteries in the county. Residents of the area have since reported seeing strange lights in the woods near the abandoned cabin property. Some locals claimed they hear a woman screaming on the anniversary of the disappearance during stormy winter nights. The cabin remains empty to this day because no one wants to buy the property due to its history. Investigators never confirmed if the stranger at the door was a human or something else entirely. The dispatch logs and the broken door are the only physical proof that something violent occurred that night. The truth about what happened to Mary remains hidden in the vast silence of the Olympic National Forest. These 3 cases are just a fraction of the unexplained events that occur in this region every year. The dense canopy of the forest hides many secrets that authorities and experts have failed to fully explain. Hikers continue to visit the park despite the warnings and the stories that circulate in the local towns. Most visitors leave with beautiful photos and memories, but a few unlucky ones encounter something truly terrifying. The files from 2015 and 2016 and 2017 sit in a dusty archive room today. They serve as a chilling reminder that the wilderness is a place where civilization and safety do not apply. In this new story, terrifying true stories that actually happened. On October 14, 2015, the dispatch logs for Piscataquis County received a disturbing call from a remote satellite phone. The transmission was heavily distorted by static and cut out abruptly after just 11 seconds of frantic screaming. Search teams deployed to the coordinates found only a single boot and a surveyor's tripod left standing upright. Authorities eventually closed the case as a misadventure, but archive notes suggest a far more complicated series of events. Elias Thorne was a 42-year-old land surveyor who specialized in mapping difficult terrain for private forestry companies. He brought his wife Jenna, who was a 39-year-old nurse, looking for a quiet weekend away. They parked their truck near a logging road in the North Maine woods, intended for a 3-day excursion. Their goal was to verify property lines near a lake that did not appear on modern digital maps. State records indicate they checked in with a ranger station at 8 in the morning on Friday. The couple hiked 6 miles into the dense forest before setting up their base camp near a rocky ridge. Elias spent the afternoon calibrating his equipment while Jenna took photographs of the changing leaves along the tree line. A recovered memory card later showed images of the campsite that appeared normal until the sun began to set. The final 3 photos on the card display a blurred figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. Investigators never confirmed if this was a person or simply a trick of the light and shadows. Dispatch logs show that the first sign of trouble occurred just after midnight on their second night there. A passing commercial pilot reported seeing a flare discharged from a location miles away from any authorized camping zones. The pilot contacted air traffic control, but no rescue mission was launched due to the lack of confirmation. Archived notes from the Forestry Service mention that illegal hunting camps were common in that specific region. It remains unclear if Elias and Jenna were the ones who fired the flare that the pilot saw. On the morning of October 16th, a logging crew discovered the Thorns truck still parked at the trailhead. The vehicle was locked and contained their wallets, along with a map that had strange markings in red ink. One of the loggers reportedly told police that the map led to an area known for magnetic anomalies. The local sheriff deputy noted in his file that the truck showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. This discovery prompted an official search and rescue operation that would become the largest in county history. Search teams combed the woods for 5 days using cadaver dogs and heat-seeking drones without any success. The weather turned severe on the third day, which hampered efforts and erased potential tracks on the ground. A volunteer searcher eventually found the surveyor tripod standing alone in a clearing 5 miles from their camp. The device was pointed directly at a dense patch of spruce trees that led into a deep ravine. County files from 2015 state that the equipment was in perfect working order when it was recovered. The single boot belonging to Jenna was found 2 days later near the bottom of that steep ravine. It was neatly placed on top of a flat stone rather than being discarded or lost during a fall. Forensic analysis revealed no blood or DNA evidence on the boot other than that of Jenna herself. Some locals claimed that the placement of the boot resembled markers used by old fur trappers in the area. Investigators never confirmed this theory and treated the item as a simple piece of lost personal property. A review of the satellite phone data provided a conflicting timeline regarding the final moments of the couple. The call log shows multiple attempts to dial out starting at 3 in the morning on Sunday. These calls failed to connect due to the lack of signal in the deep valleys of the woods. The final successful connection was the 11-second call that reached dispatch hours after the initial attempts failed. The audio from that call was analyzed by state technicians who could not identify the background noise. The search was officially suspended on October 22nd after covering over 40 square miles of dense wilderness terrain. The family of the missing couple hired a private investigator to continue the search for another 2 months. This investigator reportedly found a makeshift shelter constructed from pine boughs roughly 10 miles north of the tripod. Inside the shelter were food wrappers that matched the brand Elias and Jenna had packed for their trip. No other physical trace of the couple has ever been found in the woods since that day. 2 years later, a hunter found a waterproof journal buried under a pile of rocks near the shelter. The handwriting in the book matched that of Elias and described a sense of being watched from the trees. The final entry was dated October 17th, which contradicts the timeline established by the official police investigation report. Elias wrote that they were moving north to escape a low humming sound that was causing them pain. Medical experts consulted on the case suggested this could be a symptom of hypothermia or acute stress reaction. The area where they disappeared remains a popular spot for hikers despite the unresolved nature of the case. Forestry officials have since placed warning signs advising visitors to stay on the marked trails at all times. A podcast producer visited the site in 2019 and recorded a similar low-frequency humming sound. She claimed the noise made her feel nauseous and disoriented until she retreated back to her vehicle. Records conflict regarding the source of this noise, with some blaming wind patterns and others citing geology. The official cause of death for Elias and Jenna remains undetermined, as their bodies were never recovered. The file from 2015 sits in the cold case archives of the Maine State Police Department. Every year, on the anniversary of their disappearance, the family posts a reward for new information on the case. Dispatch logs from that night remain the only hard evidence of the terror they experienced in the end. The mystery of what happened in those woods continues to haunt those who study the available data. In this new story, small-town horror stories that actually happened. The mid-morning sun beat down on the dusty pavement of Skidmore, Missouri on July 10th, 1981, creating shimmering waves of heat that distorted the view of the D&G Tavern's unassuming facade. Inside the dim bar, the air was thick with a tension so palpable it felt like a physical weight pressing against the chests of the patrons, most of whom were local men who had gathered not for leisure but out of a desperate, suffocating fear. Outside, a silver and maroon pickup truck idled roughly, its engine creating a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet street, a sound that had come to symbolize a reign of terror for the nearly 300 residents of this isolated farming community. A man named Ken Rex McElroy sat in the driver's seat of that truck, a lit cigarette dangling from his lips and a cold arrogance in his eyes, while his young wife Trenna sat frozen beside him, seemingly aware that the atmosphere in the town had shifted from passive dread to volatile resolve. Seconds later, the sharp crack of gunfire shattered the silence, echoing off the brick buildings and sending birds scattering from the telephone wires, marking the violent end to a decades-long nightmare that the justice system had repeatedly failed to stop. When the smoke cleared, Ken McElroy slumped dead against the steering wheel, struck by bullets from at least 2 different firearms, yet not a single person in the crowd of nearly 60 witnesses would ever admit to seeing who pulled the trigger. Skidmore was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, a tight-knit agricultural hub in Nottoway County where doors were left unlocked and neighbors relied on one another for survival during the harsh harvest seasons. However, this idyllic image of rural American life had been slowly corroded over 20 years by the presence of one man who operated with total impunity and a terrifying disregard for human life. Ken McElroy was described by locals not merely as a bully, but as a predator who understood exactly how to exploit the fears of a small town and the procedural gaps of the law. He was a large man with slicked-back dark hair and piercing eyes, known to carry large sums of cash and drive expensive trucks while engaging in theft, assault, and intimidation that escalated from livestock rustling to attempted murder. State records from the time indicate that McElroy was indicted 21 times on various felony charges over the course of his life, yet he never spent a significant amount of time behind bars, a fact that baffled and terrified the community. His lawyer was skilled at obtaining continuances, delaying trials until witnesses were either intimidated into silence or physically threatened, with some reportedly waking up to find McElroy parked outside their homes in the middle of the night, watching them from the darkness. The psychological toll on the town reached a breaking point involving a local grocer named Ernest Bowenkamp, a 70-year-old man who was beloved by the community for his gentle nature and service to the town. Tensions began over a trivial dispute involving McElroy's young daughter and a piece of candy at Bowenkamp's store, an incident that McElroy used as a pretext to launch a campaign of harassment against the elderly couple. Witnesses reportedly observed McElroy stalking the Bowenkamps, sitting in his truck outside their store for hours, and occasionally making threatening gestures that suggested imminent violence. The situation escalated drastically one evening when McElroy confronted Bo Bowenkamp on the loading dock of the grocery store, pulling out a shotgun and firing it directly into the elderly man's neck. Miraculously, Bowenkamp survived the assault, and for the first time, the town felt a glimmer of hope that McElroy would finally be removed from society for good. The state prosecutors charged McElroy with assault with intent to kill, a serious felony that carried a lengthy prison sentence, and the residents of Skidmore prayed that the legal system would finally protect them. However, the outcome of the trial in 1981 served only to deepen the town's despair and sense of abandonment. McElroy was convicted of second-degree assault, but instead of being remanded to custody immediately, he was released on bond pending his appeal, free to return to Skidmore and torment the very people who had testified against him. The terror in the town intensified as McElroy was seen drinking at the local tavern with a bayonet attached to his rifle, reportedly vowing to finish what he had started with the Bowenkamp family. Dispatch logs and local reports from that week describe a community living under siege, with families sleeping with loaded guns on their nightstands and parents refusing to let their children play outside. The legal system's inability to enforce McElroy's bond conditions, which included a prohibition on carrying firearms, signaled to the residents that they were entirely on their own. It was in this climate of absolute desperation that a town meeting was called at the local Legion Hall on the morning of July 10th, ostensibly to discuss legal avenues to protect themselves, but the mood in the room suggested a darker, more frantic energy. As the meeting at the Legion Hall concluded, word reached the gathered men that Ken McElroy had just arrived in town and was sitting at the D&G Tavern, brazenly drinking in the middle of the day with his rifle close at hand. The group of men, numbering between 30 and 60 depending on conflicting accounts, moved together down the main street toward the bar, a silent procession of farmers, shopkeepers, and fathers who had reached their limit. They did not run or shout, but moved with a grim, collective purpose that seemed to paralyze the air around them. Inside the tavern, McElroy finished his drink, seemingly unbothered by the gathering crowd outside, perhaps believing that his reputation would once again protect him from any real consequences. He purchased a 6-pack of beer to go, and with Trina trailing behind him, he walked out the front door and climbed into his silver Chevrolet Silverado. The crowd surrounded the truck, standing in a tight semicircle that blocked any potential exit, their faces unreadable and their hands hidden in pockets or crossed over their chests. McElroy started the engine, the vehicle idling loudly in the tense silence of the street, and he reportedly reached for a cigarette, casually lighting it as he looked out at the faces of the men he had terrorized for years. Trina, seated in the passenger seat, later claimed she saw a man pull a weapon, but the sequence of events that followed happened with a speed and coordination that suggested a sudden release of pent-up rage. 2 distinct calibers of gunfire erupted almost simultaneously, shattering the glass of the truck's rear window and striking McElroy in the head and neck. The shots were precise and final. Trina screamed as the glass rained down on her, scrambling out of the passenger side door covered in her husband's blood while McElroy's body went limp. The engine continued to run, the only sound in the sudden, deafening quiet that followed the gunfire. The men who had surrounded the truck did not flee. They simply stood there for a moment, observing the scene before slowly dispersing back to their lives, leaving the body of their tormentor sitting in the midday sun. When the investigators from outside the county arrived, they found a crime scene that was both chaotic and impeccably sanitized of actionable evidence. The Federal Bureau of Investigation eventually became involved, conducting hundreds of interviews in an attempt to identify the shooter or shooters. However, the agents hit a wall of silence that was impenetrable. Despite the fact that the shooting occurred in broad daylight on the main street of town with dozens of witnesses present, every single person interviewed claimed they saw nothing. Some said they were looking the other way at that exact moment, others claimed the sun was in their eyes, and some simply stated they had ducked for cover when the shots rang out and saw no faces. The county prosecutor was unable to file charges against anyone as there was no physical evidence linking a specific gun to the bullets found in McElroy's body and no witness testimony to corroborate Trina's account. The town of Skidmore had collectively decided that the death of Ken McElroy was not a crime to be solved, but a necessary act of survival. To this day, the murder of the town bully remains officially unsolved, a dark secret buried under the soil of rural Missouri. The horror of Skidmore is not just in the violence of that July day, but in the realization of what happens when a community is pushed beyond the brink of endurance by a predator the law cannot touch. The residents resumed their lives, but the shadow of the event lingered over the town for decades, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and unresolved trauma. Years later, tragic events continued to plague the area, including the disappearance of a young man named Branson Perry and the gruesome murder of a pregnant woman in a neighboring town, leading some to whisper that the town was cursed by the violence of its past. But the story of Ken McElroy stands as the defining nightmare, a true account of a small American town that looked into the abyss of lawlessness and decided that the only way to save itself was to commit a sin that everyone would agree to forget. The identity of the person who fired the fatal shot is likely known by several people still living in the area, but they will take that secret to their graves, leaving the official records to forever state that Ken McElroy was killed by a person or persons unknown. In another corner of the American heartland, a different kind of horror was unfolding in the small town of Circleville, Ohio, beginning in 1976. Unlike the brute physical violence of Skidmore, the terror in Circleville was psychological, arriving in the mailboxes of residents in the form of anonymous block-lettered notes. The letters were postmarked from Columbus, but clearly written by someone who had an intimate and disturbing knowledge of the town's most private secrets. The first target was a school bus driver named Mary Gillespie, who received a letter accusing her of having an extramarital affair with the local school superintendent. The tone of the letters was hateful, threatening, and obsessive, warning Mary that her house was being watched and that her life was in danger if she did not end the alleged relationship. The writer seemed to know her schedule, her movements, and the layout of her home, creating a sensation of being constantly observed by an invisible enemy. Mary tried to keep the letters a secret, but the writer soon escalated the campaign, sending similar letters to her husband, Ron Gillespie, demanding that he take action against his wife. The situation turned deadly in August of 1977 when Ron Gillespie received a phone call that reportedly enraged him. He told his children he was going to confront the letter writer and drove off in his pickup truck armed with a handgun. A short time later, Ron was found dead, his truck having crashed into a tree. The official report stated that he had lost control of the vehicle while driving under the influence, but friends and family noted that his gun had been fired once, a detail that investigators could not fully explain. The sheriff ruled the death an accident, but the letters did not stop. In fact, they became more vicious, accusing the sheriff himself of covering up the truth about Ron's death. The terror gripped the entire town, as residents began looking at their neighbors with suspicion, wondering who among them was capable of such relentless harassment. The writer's knowledge was so specific, mentioning private conversations and hidden activities, that it seemed impossible for it to be an outsider. The campaign of terror reached a bizarre peak in 1983 when Mary Gillespie was driving her bus route and saw a sign along the road threatening her teenage daughter. When she stopped to remove the sign, she discovered a box attached to it with twine. Inside the box was a loaded handgun rigged to fire at anyone who opened it, a booby trap designed to kill. Fortunately, the device malfunctioned and Mary was unharmed. Investigators traced the serial number of the gun to Paul Freshour, Mary's former brother-in-law, who was subsequently arrested and convicted of attempted murder. The town breathed a sigh of relief, believing the monster had been caught. However, while Freshour sat in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison, hundreds of new letters were mailed to residents of Circleville, all written in the same distinctive block lettering and containing new, intimate details about the townspeople's lives. The warden confirmed that Freshour had no access to writing materials and his mail was strictly monitored, yet the letters continued for years, taunting the police and the community with the fact that the true writer was still out there watching and waiting.